My 8-year-old daughter broke her teacher's arm, and the school board gave her an award. The principal's voice on the phone was shaking when she told me there'd been an incident. Mrs. Ashford said I needed to come to Oakmont Elementary immediately, that my daughter Harper had injured her teacher and an ambulance was on the way. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, my mind racing through possibilities that made no sense. Harper was 8 years old, barely 60 pounds, the kind of kid who cried when she accidentally stepped on ants. She'd never been in a fight, never shown aggression, spent most of her time reading books about animals and drawing elaborate fantasy worlds in her notebooks. Whatever had happened couldn't possibly involve her breaking someone's arm. The school parking lot had 2 police cars and an ambulance when I arrived. Parents were clustered near the entrance, phones out, filming or calling other parents to spread whatever gossip they'd gathered. I pushed through them and found Mrs. Ashford waiting inside with Officer Denise Morton, who I recognized from the school resource program. The principal looked pale and kept wringing her hands. Officer Morton's expression was harder to read, something between concern and what might have been approval. They led me to the nurse's office where Harper sat on the examination table with a blanket around her shoulders. Her face was blotchy from crying and her hands were shaking. When she saw me, she burst into fresh tears and I pulled her into my arms, checking her for injuries. She had red marks on both wrists and a bruise forming on her upper arm. Her shirt was torn at the collar. I asked what happened and she just shook her head and pressed her face against my shoulder. Mrs. Ashford cleared her throat and explained that Harper's third-grade teacher, Mr. Leonard Priest, was being transported to County Medical with what paramedics believed was a broken radius and possible nerve damage. That Harper had somehow caused the injury during what Priest was calling an unprovoked attack in the classroom. I pulled back to look at Harper's face and asked if that was true. She nodded and whispered that she'd hurt Mr. Priest, that she'd twisted his arm and heard it crack, that she was sorry, but she'd had to do it. Her voice broke on those last words and I felt my stomach drop. Officer Morton asked if we could speak privately and led me into the hallway while the nurse stayed with Harper. Morton pulled out her notebook and explained that according to other students, Harper had grabbed Priest's arm during a confrontation and applied some kind of joint lock that resulted in the fracture. Multiple witnesses confirmed Harper had initiated the physical contact. Priest was threatening to press assault charges against an 8-year-old child. Morton's voice was carefully neutral as she relayed this information, but I caught something underneath. She asked me directly if Harper had any martial arts training or if I'd taught her self-defense techniques. I said no, that Harper took piano lessons and art classes, but nothing physical. Morton made a note and said she'd need to interview Harper formally once her parents were present. I told her I was Harper's only parent, that her father had died in a construction accident when she was 3. Morton's expression softened slightly, and she said she'd try to make the interview as gentle as possible, but that Priest was insisting on pressing charges and the department had to follow protocol. Back in the nurse's office, I sat beside Harper and asked her quietly to tell me what happened. She looked at me with those big dark eyes so much like her father's and said Mr. Priest had been hurting her, that he'd been doing it for weeks and she'd finally made him stop. My blood went cold. I asked what she meant by hurting and she pulled up her sleeve to show me more bruises I hadn't noticed before. Finger marks on her forearm. She said Mr. Priest grabbed her during class when she made mistakes, that he'd pull her to the front of the room by her arm and make her stand there while he pointed out her errors to the other students. That morning he'd grabbed her so hard she thought her arm would break, and something inside her had snapped. She'd remembered something from a YouTube video about self-defense she'd watched months ago. She'd grabbed his wrist with both hands and twisted as hard as she could while stepping back. She'd heard the crack, and he'd screamed and fallen to his knees. Then she'd run to the corner of the classroom and waited for the other teacher to arrive. I felt rage building in my chest but kept my voice calm as I asked why she hadn't told me Priest was hurting her. Harper said she'd tried, but I'd been so busy with work and she hadn't wanted to bother me. That Priest had told her and the other students that complaining about teachers would get them in trouble, that parents always believed teachers over kids. I thought about the past 2 months, about how I'd been pulling overtime at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, about coming home exhausted and asking Harper generic questions about school that she'd answered with generic responses, about failing to notice my daughter was being abused right under my nose. Mrs. Ashford returned with a woman I didn't recognize, introducing her as Dr. Beverly Kim from Child Protective Services. Dr. Kim had kind eyes but a no-nonsense manner as she asked to examine Harper's injuries. I stayed in the room while Dr. Kim documented every bruise, every finger mark, taking photographs with a professional camera and making detailed notes. She asked Harper gentle questions about when the injuries occurred and how they'd happened. Harper answered in a small voice, describing incidents over the past 6 weeks where Priest had grabbed her, pulled her, shaken her by the shoulders when she didn't understand math problems quickly enough. Dr. Kim's expression grew darker with each answer, but she kept her tone neutral and reassuring. When the examination finished, Dr. Kim asked to speak with me privately. In Mrs. Ashford's office, she showed me the photographs on her camera and said the bruising patterns were consistent with repeated physical discipline that crossed well into abuse territory. She said she'd be filing a formal report with CPS and recommending a criminal investigation into Priest's conduct. She asked if I'd noticed the bruises before, and I had to admit I hadn't, that I'd been working long shifts and Harper usually wore long sleeves even at home. Dr. Kim said not to blame myself, that abusers were skilled at hiding their behavior and making victims feel like they couldn't speak up. But her reassurance didn't touch the guilt crushing my chest. Officer Morton returned to conduct Harper's formal interview, which she recorded on her body camera. She asked Harper to describe what happened that morning in her own words. Harper explained that Mr. Priest had been teaching multiplication, and she'd gotten an answer wrong. He'd called her to the front of the classroom and grabbed her arm, squeezing hard enough that she'd cried out. He'd told her she was stupid and lazy, and that pain would help her remember better next time. When she'd tried to pull away, he'd squeezed harder. That's when she'd twisted his arm the way she'd seen in the video. Morton asked what video, and Harper described watching a compilation of self-defense moves on YouTube several months ago, something about techniques for smaller people against larger attackers. She'd been researching after an older boy on the bus had been bothering her. She'd watched it once and apparently retained enough to execute a basic wrist lock under stress. Morton asked if Mr. Priest had hurt Harper before, and she nodded, describing at least 8 separate incidents. Morton asked if he'd hurt other students, and Harper said yes, that he grabbed lots of kids, but especially the ones who struggled with schoolwork. She named 5 other students specifically. Morton thanked Harper for her bravery and said she'd done the right thing protecting herself. That nobody was allowed to hurt children, not even teachers. Harper asked if she was going to jail, and Morton said absolutely not, that what she'd done was self-defense and the law protected people who defended themselves from harm. Mrs. Ashford had been sitting silently during the interview, but now she spoke up, her voice tight. She said the school would need to conduct its own investigation before making any determinations about Harper's enrollment status. That regardless of circumstances, Harper had injured a teacher, and there would be consequences. I felt my temper flare and asked what consequences the school would face for employing a teacher who'd been abusing students for weeks without intervention. Mrs. Ashford's face reddened, and she said that was a separate matter, that if the allegations were proven true, then appropriate action would be taken against Mr. Priest. I pointed out that the allegations were already proven by the bruises on my daughter's body and apparently on other students. Mrs. Ashford said she couldn't comment on ongoing investigations. Officer Morton interrupted to say she'd be recommending assault charges against Priest, not Harper, and that the district attorney would make the final determination. She said based on the physical evidence and witness statements, she believed Harper had acted in lawful self-defense against an adult who was committing battery against a minor. Mrs. Ashford looked like she'd been slapped. She said the school board would need to review everything before making official statements. Morton said they'd better review it quickly because this was going to be a major news story as soon as word got out that a teacher had been abusing students and the school had failed to stop it. I took Harper home and called my sister Lauren to come stay with us. While we waited, I made Harper her favorite dinner and tried to act normal even though my hands were shaking with rage. When Lauren arrived, I filled her in and she immediately said we needed a lawyer. She pulled out her phone and started researching attorneys who specialized in education law and child advocacy. By evening, she'd found someone willing to take an emergency consultation. The attorney's name was Marcus Delacroix, and he had 20 years of experience suing school districts for negligence. We spoke on the phone for an hour while Lauren stayed with Harper. Marcus listened to everything and asked pointed questions about the school's knowledge of Priest's behavior, about whether other parents had complained, about documentation of Harper's injuries. He said we had grounds for a substantial lawsuit against the district for failing to protect students from a known abuser. He'd take the case on contingency and start building our complaint immediately. But more importantly, he'd file for an emergency restraining order keeping Priest away from all students pending the criminal investigation. He said to document everything, save every email and text from the school, and refuse any pressure to agree to disciplinary action against Harper. The next morning, the story hit local news. Someone had leaked information about a teacher being injured by a student at Oakmont Elementary, though initial reports didn't include names or details about abuse. The framing was sensational. 8-year-old breaks teacher's arm, questions about violence in schools, concerns about student discipline. My phone started ringing with reporters wanting comments. I ignored them all on Marcus's advice. But the narrative was forming before the truth could catch up, painting Harper as a violent child who'd attacked a beloved teacher. I felt sick watching the coverage, knowing how wrong they had it. By afternoon, the story shifted. Officer Morton had filed her report, which became public record, and someone leaked it to the press. Suddenly, the headlines changed. Teacher accused of abusing students. Child acted in self-defense. School failed to intervene despite complaints. A reporter from the main city paper called me, and this time Marcus said I could give a brief statement. I told them my daughter had been physically abused by her teacher for weeks and had finally defended herself when the abuse became intolerable. That the school had ignored warning signs and other families' concerns. That we'd be pursuing both criminal charges and civil action. The reporter asked if I was proud of Harper for fighting back, and I said I was devastated that she'd been put in a position where she had to. The next day, 3 more families came forward. Their children were also in Priest's class and had bruises and marks from his grabbing and pulling. One mother, Angela Torres, showed photographs she'd taken of her son's injuries 2 weeks earlier when she'd complained to Mrs. Ashford about Priest's rough handling. Mrs. Ashford had promised to address it, but apparently had done nothing. Angela had documentation of her complaint, including emails with the principal. Another father, Douglas Kim, said his daughter had come home crying multiple times saying Mr. Priest hurt her arms during lessons. He'd scheduled a meeting with Priest, who dismissed it as normal classroom management of difficult students. Douglas had accepted that explanation because he'd been taught to respect teachers' authority. Now he was furious at himself for not protecting his daughter. The families united and hired Marcus as a group. He filed a class action lawsuit against the school district alleging systematic failure to protect students from physical abuse by staff. The case named Mrs. Ashford specifically for receiving multiple complaints and failing to act, and named the superintendent and board for inadequate oversight and teacher discipline procedures. The district's response was to place Priest on administrative leave pending investigation and to release a statement expressing concern for all students' well-being. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology, just careful legal language designed to limit liability. Parents were outraged. A group organized a protest outside the district office demanding transparency about what officials had known and when they'd known it. Local media covered the growing scandal extensively. Priest hired an attorney who released a statement denying all abuse allegations and claiming he'd been viciously attacked by a disturbed child who'd been poorly disciplined at home. The attack on Harper and on me personally in that statement made my blood boil. Marcus immediately filed a defamation suit and demanded a retraction. The school board called an emergency meeting to address the crisis. Over 200 parents packed the auditorium and dozens more stood outside. I attended with Marcus and Lauren, leaving Harper with a trusted babysitter. The board members looked uncomfortable as parents took turns at the microphone during public comment. Angela Torres spoke passionately about her son's injuries and Mrs. Ashford's inadequate response. Douglas Kim described feeling betrayed by an institution he'd trusted with his daughter's safety. Another mother revealed that her child had transferred out of Priest's class mid-year due to his harsh treatment, but she'd been told by administration that personality conflicts between teachers and students were normal. The testimony painted a picture of systematic failure, of warning signs ignored, of parents' concerns dismissed. When it was my turn to speak, I held up enlarged photos of Harper's bruises that Dr. Kim had taken. I described my 8-year-old daughter being grabbed, squeezed, hurt repeatedly by a man in a position of authority, while the school administration did nothing despite receiving complaints. I said Harper had been forced to defend herself because the adults responsible for protecting her had failed, that she'd broken her abuser's arm, and I couldn't even be sorry about it because it was the only thing that had finally stopped the abuse. The room erupted in applause. Board members looked stunned. The superintendent, a polished woman named Dr. Valerie Brennan, tried to restore order and promised a thorough investigation. Parents shouted her down, demanding immediate action, not more investigations. Someone yelled that the investigation should have happened months ago when the first complaints came in. Dr. Brennan's face flushed as she defended the district's protocols while admitting they'd clearly been insufficient in this case. The board voted to hire an outside investigator to review all complaints about Priest and to audit the district's procedures for handling teacher misconduct. It felt like too little too late, a PR move designed to calm outrage rather than genuine accountability. Marcus filed for expedited discovery in our lawsuit, demanding all personnel files related to Priest, all complaints received about him, all communications between parents and administration, and all district policies on physical discipline. He also subpoenaed Mrs. Ashford's emails and phone records for the past year. The district tried to block the subpoenas on privacy grounds, but the judge sided with us, ruling that the public interest in protecting children from abuse outweighed privacy concerns. When the documents came through, they revealed something worse than we'd imagined. Priest had complaints going back 3 years, not just months. At his previous school in another district, parents had reported similar behavior: rough handling, grabbing students, using physical intimidation. That school had quietly encouraged him to resign rather than face formal discipline. He'd moved to Oakmont with a clean record because his file had been sanitized as part of his departure agreement. Mrs. Ashford had received 7 formal complaints about Priest in his 2 years at Oakmont. She'd spoken to him informally each time but never documented the conversations or reported them to the superintendent. She'd accepted his explanations that he was maintaining classroom order with challenging students. The pattern was clear: administrators protecting their own interests over children's safety, passing problems between districts rather than addressing them, prioritizing reputation over accountability. Marcus leaked the documents to the press. The resulting headlines were devastating for the district. School hired teacher with history of abuse, principal ignored repeated warnings, district policies enabled child abuser. Dr. Brennan tried damage control with a press conference announcing Mrs. Ashford had been placed on administrative leave and promising comprehensive policy reforms. But the public wasn't accepting half measures anymore. Parents demanded criminal charges against administrators who'd known about abuse and failed to report it as mandated by law. The district attorney opened an investigation into whether Mrs. Ashford and other officials had violated mandatory reporting requirements. In our state, school administrators were required by law to report suspected child abuse to authorities within 24 hours. Mrs. Ashford had documented evidence of physical abuse in the form of parent complaints and witness statements, but had never filed reports. She'd committed a crime by covering it up. The criminal investigation expanded to include the superintendent's office when emails revealed Dr. Brennan had been aware of complaints about Priest, but had deferred to Mrs. Ashford's judgment about how to handle them. The board members claimed they'd never been informed, though that raised questions about oversight failures. The whole leadership structure was implicated in the systematic failure to protect students. Priest himself faced criminal charges, multiple counts of battery against minors, assault, and child abuse. His lawyer maintained his innocence and claimed reasonable discipline, but the physical evidence and witness testimony from students and parents made his case nearly impossible to defend. The prosecution had photographs, medical records, sworn statements, and a clear pattern of behavior. Trial was scheduled for 6 months out, and Priest remained out on bail, prohibited from contact with minors or employment in educational settings. During this period, Harper struggled. She had nightmares about Mr. Priest, woke up crying about whether she'd hurt him too badly, worried about whether the other kids blamed her for the scandal that had consumed the school. Her therapist, Dr. Sharon Vance, explained that Harper was experiencing trauma from both the abuse itself and from having to use violence to escape it. That even justified self-defense could be psychologically damaging, especially for children who were taught to never hurt others. Dr. Vance said Harper needed reassurance that she'd done nothing wrong, that the adults had failed her and she'd had to save herself, that the guilt she felt was misplaced but understandable. I spent hours talking with Harper about safety and boundaries and adults who break trust, about how most teachers were good people who would never hurt students, but that some people misused authority and those people needed to face consequences. She asked if I was mad at her for breaking Mr. Priest's arm, and I told her absolutely not, that I was proud of her for protecting herself even though I wished she'd never been in that position. She asked why the other kids' parents hadn't stopped him earlier, and I had no good answer. Just that sometimes adults made terrible mistakes that hurt children, and we all had to do better. The preliminary hearing for Priest's criminal case was open to the public. I attended with Marcus, wanting to see the man who'd hurt my daughter face some consequences. Priest looked smaller than I'd imagined, ordinary in his cheap suit, nothing about him suggesting monster. But that was the point, wasn't it? Abusers didn't look evil. They looked normal, trustworthy. The prosecution presented its evidence methodically. Photos of bruises on 7 different children, testimony from Officer Morton about her investigation, statements from students describing repeated incidents of Priest grabbing and squeezing them. Medical experts testified that the injuries were consistent with forceful gripping by adult hands, that some bruises showed patterns of repeated trauma to the same areas. Priest's lawyer tried to argue that the bruises could have been from playground accidents or rough play, but the consistency and location made that defense laughable. The judge found probable cause on all counts in scheduled trial. Priest's lawyer immediately approached Marcus about plea negotiations. The civil lawsuit moved forward simultaneously. The district's insurance company wanted to settle quickly to limit exposure, but Marcus advised holding out for maximum damages to send a message about the cost of negligence. He argued we could get not just compensation for Harper's injuries and trauma, but punitive damages for the district's knowing failure to protect students despite documented complaints. The discovery process revealed even more damaging information. Internal emails showed district officials discussing how to minimize parent complaints about Priest without actually addressing the underlying problems. One email from Dr. Brennan to Mrs. Ashford advised her to document conversations with complaining parents in ways that emphasized the parent's emotional state rather than the substance of complaints, creating a record that could later suggest overreaction by parents rather than genuine concerns. The calculated nature of the cover-up made it worse than simple negligence. These were educated professionals deliberately choosing to protect a teacher and the district's reputation over children's safety. The outside investigator hired by the board released her report, and it was scathing. She'd interviewed over 50 current and former students, reviewed 5 years of records, and found a pattern of physical intimidation and boundary violations by Priest that should have triggered intervention years ago. She identified specific points where administrators could have and should have acted but didn't. She recommended termination of Mrs. Ashford, censure of Dr. Brennan, comprehensive retraining for all staff on mandatory reporting, and implementation of new oversight systems. The board accepted the recommendations, and Mrs. Ashford was formally fired. Dr. Brennan resigned under pressure rather than face censure and possible criminal charges. The leadership vacuum created chaos as interim administrators tried to stabilize the district while parents demanded accountability. 3 board members who'd been present during some of the failures chose not to run for re-election. The scandal had become a referendum on the entire district's governance and culture. Through all of this, Harper continued therapy and slowly started healing. She'd transferred to a different elementary school, where the principal met with us personally to discuss safety protocols and assure us that student welfare was the top priority. The new teacher was a veteran educator named Mrs. Joan Whitfield, who had a gentle manner and an open-door policy for parent communication. Harper was anxious at first, but gradually began to trust again. She made new friends and started bringing home artwork and stories that showed her imagination was recovering. One evening, about 4 months after the incident, Harper asked me if I thought she'd done the right thing breaking Mr. Priest's arm. I told her that I wished adults had protected her so she never had to make that choice, but that given the circumstances, she'd done exactly what she needed to do to keep herself safe. She was quiet for a moment, then asked if defending yourself made you a bad person. I said absolutely not, that knowing how to protect yourself was important, but that the best outcome was when adults created environments where children never had to. She seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to her homework. The criminal trial began in month 7. The prosecution called student after student to testify about Priest's treatment of them. Most were elementary school children taking the stand in a courtroom, which was traumatic in itself. Harper had to testify about the day she'd broken Priest's arm. Marcus had prepared her extensively, and Dr. Vance had worked with her on managing courtroom anxiety. But watching my 8-year-old daughter describe being grabbed and hurt by her teacher while Priest sat at the defense table staring at her made me physically ill. She explained in a clear voice how Mr. Priest had squeezed her arm so hard she'd thought it would break, how she'd asked him to let go and he'd squeezed harder, how she'd finally twisted his wrist because she didn't know what else to do. She said she'd been scared he was going to really hurt her. Under cross-examination, Priest's lawyer tried to suggest Harper had a history of behavioral problems and violence. Marcus objected immediately and the judge sustained it, warning defense counsel about attacking a child witness. Harper held up well, answering questions without breaking down, but I could see the toll it took. That night, she had nightmares again for the first time in weeks. Other students testified to similar treatment. The pattern was overwhelming and consistent. Priest's defense was that he'd maintained firm but appropriate discipline with difficult students, that physical guidance was sometimes necessary in classroom management. His lawyer brought in educational experts who testified about acceptable physical intervention with students. But the prosecution's medical experts demolished that defense, showing that the force required to create the documented bruising went far beyond any accepted classroom management technique. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Priest showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the civil settlement negotiations reached conclusion. The district's insurance company offered $2.5 million to be split among the 7 families who'd joined the class action, plus agreement to implement all recommended reforms, plus public admission of failures in the case. Marcus advised that we could likely get more if we went to trial, but that trial would take years and keep the families locked in this trauma. He recommended acceptance. The families met and discussed it. We decided that the admission of fault mattered more than maximum damages, and that the policy reforms might actually protect future students. We accepted the settlement. The funds were placed in trusts for the children's future education and therapeutic needs. The public admission by the district made headlines. School board acknowledges systematic failures enabled teachers' abuse of students. The statement included specific admissions about ignored complaints, inadequate oversight, and prioritization of reputation over safety. It was more accountability than most institutions ever provided. Priest's sentencing hearing drew a packed courtroom. The judge allowed victim impact statements from families. I spoke about Harper's nightmares and anxiety, about how a year of abuse had damaged her trust in teachers and authority figures, about the guilt she felt for defending herself because no one had taught her that fighting back against adults was acceptable when they were hurting you. Angela Torres talked about her son's fear of school and male teachers specifically. Douglas Kim described his daughter's belief that she'd deserved the rough treatment because she struggled with math. Each statement added to the portrait of damage Priest had inflicted on vulnerable children. The judge listened to everything and then addressed Priest directly. She said that teachers held positions of profound trust and authority over children, and that violating that trust through physical abuse was among the most serious breaches of professional duty. That Priest had used his authority to hurt children who had no power to stop him, and had continued even when caught because he'd believed the system would protect him. That he'd been right to believe that, until Harper had finally fought back. The judge sentenced Priest to 8 years in prison, followed by lifetime prohibition from working with children in any capacity. He'd serve at least 6 years before parole eligibility. He'd have to register as someone who'd committed crimes against children. His teaching license was permanently revoked. He was taken into custody immediately to begin serving his sentence. I watched him being led away in handcuffs and felt something release in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice had finally been served, however imperfect and delayed. 2 weeks after sentencing, I received a letter from the new school board president, a woman named Rita Thompson, who'd been elected in the special election following the scandal. She wrote that the board had been discussing ways to acknowledge the courage shown by students who'd come forward about Priest's abuse. that they wanted to recognize specifically Harper's action in stopping the abuse when all adults had failed. She asked if Harper and I would attend the next board meeting for a special presentation. I was skeptical about what felt like a publicity stunt, but Marcus reviewed the letter and said it seemed genuine. He suggested that public acknowledgement might actually help Harper's healing by validating that she'd done the right thing. I discussed it with Dr. Vance, who agreed that formal recognition from the institution that had failed Harper might provide meaningful closure. I asked Harper how she felt about it, and she said she wanted to go, that she wanted people to know she hadn't been bad or violent, that she'd protected herself because she'd had to. The board meeting was on a Thursday evening. The auditorium was full again, but this time the energy was different, supportive rather than angry. Parents who'd been at the earlier contentious meetings were back, but now they were holding signs thanking Harper and the other children for their bravery. When our turn came, Rita Thompson asked Harper and me to come forward. She addressed the room and spoke about institutional failure and the courage of children who'd been forced to protect themselves and each other. She said the board had established new protocols to ensure no child would ever again have to defend themselves against an abusive teacher because every complaint would be investigated promptly and thoroughly. Then she turned to Harper and said that while the board deeply regretted that Harper had been put in a position where she'd had to protect herself through physical force, they wanted to acknowledge that her action had finally stopped abuse that harmed many students. That her courage in fighting back had exposed systematic failures and led to reforms that would protect future students. Rita presented Harper with a formal certificate of recognition for bravery and advocacy for student safety. The room erupted in applause. People stood and cheered. Harper looked overwhelmed and small holding the certificate. I put my arm around her shoulders and she leaned against me. After the meeting, dozens of parents approached us to thank Harper. Some were families whose children had been in Priest's class. Others were simply parents who appreciated that someone had finally forced the district to confront its failures. Angela Torres hugged both of us and said Harper's action had given her son permission to talk about what had happened, that he'd been holding it inside until he'd seen that speaking up was safe. Douglas Kim's daughter gave Harper a drawing she'd made showing Harper as a superhero. The attention was overwhelming but mostly positive. Harper was quiet on the drive home. I asked how she was feeling and she said she was glad people didn't think she was bad anymore, but that she still wished none of it had happened. That she wished Mr. Priest had just been a good teacher, and she'd never had to hurt anyone. I told her that was completely understandable, that violence was never a good outcome even when necessary. That being recognized for bravery didn't mean anyone thought breaking bones was good, just that they understood she'd had no choice. She nodded and went quiet again. That night, I found her sitting in her room with the certificate and all the cards and drawings people had given her. She asked me if she should be proud of what she'd done. I thought carefully before answering. I told her that pride wasn't quite the right word, that what she should feel was confidence in her ability to protect herself, and sorrow that she'd been in a situation requiring it, and hope that other kids would never have to make the choice she'd made, that it was okay to have complicated feelings about something traumatic even when everyone said she'd done the right thing. She seemed relieved by that permission to not feel simply heroic. Over the next year, the district implemented sweeping reforms. Anonymous reporting systems were established for students and parents to report concerns about teacher conduct. An independent ombudsman was hired to investigate complaints outside the administrative chain of command. Training programs were developed to help staff recognize and respond to signs of abuse. Mandatory reporting protocols were strengthened with criminal penalties for administrators who failed to report. The changes were named the Harper Holloway Student Protection Initiative in recognition of the case that had sparked reform. Harper continued therapy and gradually the nightmares decreased. She developed new interests beyond her art, joining a drama club and a youth environmental group. She was still more cautious around authority figures than before, quicker to speak up when something felt wrong, but Dr. Vance said that was actually healthy. That appropriate skepticism toward authority was a reasonable response to Harper's experience and would likely protect her in the future. She maintained friendships with some of the other kids from Priest's former class, bonded by shared experience that no one else could fully understand. In 6th grade, Harper wrote an essay about her experience for a school project on personal challenges. She described the abuse, her decision to fight back, the aftermath, and what she'd learned. She wrote that she'd learned adults weren't always right or safe, that sometimes you had to protect yourself even when it was scary, that justice took time but was possible. She wrote that she'd also learned about forgiveness and healing, that holding on to anger about the past kept you from moving forward. Her teacher submitted the essay to a statewide competition for student writing, and it won first place in the middle school category. The award came with a $1,000 scholarship toward college. When we went to the award ceremony, Harper read portions of her essay to an audience of educators and students. She spoke clearly and confidently about institutional failure and personal responsibility and the importance of listening to children. The room was silent except for occasional sniffles from people crying. After she finished, the applause lasted several minutes. A woman from the state education department approached me afterward and said Harper's essay would be used in administrator training programs across the state as an example of why every complaint mattered and every child's voice deserved to be heard. 3 years after the incident, I received a message from Leonard Priest. He'd been allowed limited internet access from prison and had found my contact information through public records. The message was short. He'd written that he'd spent 3 years in therapy and substance abuse treatment, that he'd come to understand the damage he'd caused and the ways his own unaddressed trauma had manifested as hurting others. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know he thought about the children he'd hurt every day, that he understood Harper had done what she'd had to do, that he was sorry for all of it. He asked if I'd be willing to participate in a restorative justice process if Harper ever wanted to confront him directly, but said he'd understand if the answer was no. I showed the message to Dr. Vance and asked her opinion. She said it was up to Harper whether she wanted any contact with Priest, that some survivors found confrontation healing, while others found it re-traumatizing. I asked Harper, and she thought about it for several days before deciding she didn't want to meet with Priest, but that she'd write him a letter. She spent weeks working on it with Dr. Vance's guidance. The letter described how his abuse had affected her, how learning she couldn't trust teachers had changed her, how she still had moments of fear around authority figures. But she also wrote that she'd learned people could change and grow, that she hoped he was becoming better, that she didn't hate him but would never forget what he'd done. She wrote that she'd forgiven him not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was hurting her more than him. She ended by saying she hoped no other kids would be hurt by anyone the way he'd hurt her. I read the letter before we sent it, and felt overwhelming pride in my daughter's emotional maturity. She'd taken something terrible and transformed it into growth. Dr. Vance said that was the definition of resilience. By high school, Harper had become an advocate for student rights and safety. She'd joined youth advisory boards for school policy reform in our district and neighboring ones. She'd spoken at state education conferences about the student perspective on safety protocols. She'd written articles for local papers about the importance of believing children when they reported mistreatment. Her experience had given her a platform and a purpose. When she was 16, Harper testified before the state legislature in support of a bill strengthening mandatory reporting requirements for educators and increasing criminal penalties for administrators who covered up abuse. She'd been invited to testify by the bill's sponsor, a legislator whose own child had experienced abuse in a different district. Harper spoke about how multiple adults had known what was happening to her, but had chosen institutional loyalty over child protection. She described the moment she'd broken her teacher's arm as both the worst and most necessary thing she'd ever done. That living with that moment had taught her that children shouldn't have to be their own protectors, that adults needed better systems and stronger accountability. The bill passed unanimously in both chambers, and the governor signed it at a public ceremony where Harper was present. When it came time to apply to colleges, Harper wrote her admission essay about that day in 3rd grade. Not about the violence itself, but about the institutional failures that had led to it and the reforms that had followed. She wrote about turning trauma into advocacy and learning that one person's courage could create change that protected thousands. She applied to schools with strong programs in education policy and child advocacy. She was accepted to her top choice with a full scholarship endowed by a foundation that supported survivors of institutional abuse. The scholarship was specifically for students committed to reforming systems that had failed them. Harper's case had become a touchstone in education circles, studied in administrator training programs as an example of catastrophic institutional failure and the importance of taking every complaint seriously. Articles had been written analyzing the case, identifying the specific points where intervention could have prevented the crisis, using it to demonstrate the real-world consequences of prioritizing reputation over safety. Leonard Priest's name became shorthand for educator abuse enabled by administrative cover-up. The Oakmont Elementary scandal had sparked a national conversation about protecting children within institutions meant to serve them. On Harper's 18th birthday, we visited the elementary school she'd attended when everything happened. The building had been renovated and the school renamed as part of the district's commitment to moving forward from its failures. A small plaque near the entrance commemorated the students who'd been harmed by institutional negligence and honored their courage in coming forward. Harper stood in front of it reading the names, including her own, and I watched her face for signs of pain or trauma. Instead, I saw determination. She said she was glad the kids who came after wouldn't have to experience what she had, that something good had come from something terrible, but that she'd always carry the weight of that moment when she'd had to choose between being hurt and hurting someone else. 4 years after Harper started college, I attended her graduation. She'd majored in public policy with a focus on education reform and child welfare. Her senior thesis had analyzed institutional accountability structures and their effectiveness in preventing abuse, using her own case as a primary example. She'd been offered positions at multiple advocacy organizations focused on children's rights. She'd accepted a job with a national nonprofit that worked to strengthen protective systems in schools. Harper's first assignment would be training administrators on recognizing and responding to abuse reports, teaching them to prioritize child safety over institutional comfort. She'd become exactly what she'd needed when she was 8, an adult who would believe children and act to protect them. Years later, watching her present at a conference on educational reform, I thought about that phone call from Mrs. Ashford telling me Harper had injured her teacher. At the ceremony where the school board had given Harper that recognition certificate, Rita Thompson had said something that stayed with me. She'd said that Harper had been forced to become her own protector because the adults responsible for her safety had failed, and that the district's recognition wasn't celebrating violence, but acknowledging the failure that had necessitated it. That the real award would be building systems where no child ever had to make the choice Harper had made. Harper's work was bringing that vision closer to reality. The broken arm that had ended one teacher's career had sparked reforms protecting thousands of children. The 8-year-old who'd fought back because no one else would had grown into an advocate fighting to ensure no child would face that choice again. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.